Chapter 2, Inside the Dragon Nursery. You've probably guessed by now that Hiccup was not your natural Viking hero. For a start, he didn't look like a hero. Somebody like Snotlout, for instance, was tall, muscly, covered in skeleton tattoos and already had the beginnings of a small moustache. This consisted of a few straggly yellow hairs clinging to his upper lip and was deeply unpleasant to look at, but still impressively manly for a boy not yet 13. Hiccup was on the small side and had the kind of face that was almost entirely unmemorable. He did have heroic hair, which was a very bright red and stood up vertically, however much you tried to wet it down with seawater. But nobody ever saw that because it was hidden under his helmet most of the time. You would never have picked Hiccup out of those 10 boys to be the hero of this story. Snotlout was good at everything and a natural leader. Dog's Breath was as tall as his father and could do amusing things like farting to the tune of the Burke National Anthem. Hiccup was just absolutely average, the kind of unremarkable, skinny, freckled boy who was easy to overlook in a crowd. So when Gobber blew the horn and moved out of sight to find a comfortable rock to sit on and eat his mussel and tomato sandwich, Snotlout pushed Hiccup out of the way and took charge. "Okay, listen up, boys," he whispered in a menacing fashion. "I'm in charge now, not the useless. And anybody who objects gets a knuckle sandwich from Dog's Breath, the Durbrain." "Ugh," grunted Dog's Breath, pounding his fists together in happy excitement. Dog's Breath was Snotlout's chief sidekick and a great big gorilla of a boy. "Bash him, Dog's Breath, to show what I mean." Dog's Breath was delighted to oblige. He gave Hiccup a shove that sent him sprawling headfirst into the snow, then ground his face in it. "Pay attention," hissed Snotlout. The boys dragged their eyes away from Dog's Breath and Hiccup and paid attention. "Rope yourselves together. The best climber should go first." "Well, that's you, of course, Snotlout," said Fishlegs. "You're the best at everything, aren't you?" Snotlout looked at Fishlegs suspiciously. It was difficult to tell whether Fishlegs was laughing at him or not because of his squint. "That's right, Fishlegs," said Snotlout. "I am. And just in case he'd been laughing at him, bash him, Dog's Breath." While Dog's Breath pushed Fishlegs down to join Hiccup in the snow, Snotlout bossily ordered everybody to rope themselves together. Hiccup and Fishlegs were the last to be tied on, just behind a flushed and triumphant Dog's Breath. "Oh, brilliant," muttered Fishlegs. "I'm about to enter a cave full of man-eating reptiles, tied up to 8 complete maniacs." "If we get to the cave," said Hiccup nervously, looking up at the sheer black cliff. Hiccup put the lighted torch between his teeth to leave his hands free and started climbing after the others. It was a perilous climb. The rocks were slippery with snow and the other boys were thoroughly overexcited, making the ascent far too quickly. At one point, Clueless missed his footing and fell, luckily onto Dog's Breath, who caught him by the back of the trousers and heaved him back onto the rock again before he brought the whole lot of them down. When they finally made it to the mouth of the cave, Hiccup looked down briefly at the sea pounding the rocks way below and swallowed very hard. "Untie the ropes," ordered Snotlout, his eyes popping with excitement at the thought of the dangers to come. "Hiccup goes into the cave first because he is the son of the chief," he sneered. "And if any of the dragons are awake, he'll be the first to know about it. Once we're in the cave, it's every man for himself. Only the strong can belong." Although he wasn't your usual mindless thug of a hooligan, Hiccup wasn't a wimp either. Being frightened is not the same as being a coward. Maybe he was as brave as anyone else there because he went to catch a dragon, despite knowing what dragons are like. And when he had climbed perilously to the mouth of the cave and found that inside there was a long twisty tunnel, he still went down it, despite not being too keen on long twisty tunnels with dragons at the end of them. The tunnel was dripping and clammy. At times it was high enough for the boys to walk upright. Then it would close down into narrow, claustrophobic holes that the boys could only just squeeze through, squirming on their stomachs with the flares held in their mouths. After 10 long minutes of walking and crawling into the heart of the cliff, the stench of dragon, a salty stink of seaweed and old mackerel heads, got stronger and stronger, until finally it became unbearable and the tunnel opened out into a ginormous cavern. The cavern was full of more dragons than Hiccup could ever have imagined existed. They were every possible colour and size. They included all the species that Hiccup had heard of and quite a few more that he hadn't. Hiccup started sweating as he looked around him at pile after pile of the animals draped over every available surface, even hanging upside down from the roof like giant bats. They were all fast asleep, and most of them were snoring in unison. This was a sound so loud and so deep that it seemed to penetrate right into Hiccup's body and vibrate around his soft insides, churning his stomach and bowels and forcing his heart to beat at the same slow dragon pulse. If just one of these countless creatures were to wake up, it would raise the alarm to the others and the boys would meet a horrible death. Hiccup had once seen a deer that had wandered too close to Wild Dragon Cliff, torn to pieces in a matter of minutes. Hiccup closed his eyes. "I will think about it," he said to himself. "I will not think about it," he said to himself. Sorry, "I will not." None of the other boys were thinking about it. Ignorance is very useful in such circumstances. Their eyes were popping with excitement as they walked through the cave, hands over their mouths to keep out the revolting smell, looking for the biggest dragon they could find that would fit in their basket. They left the torches in a pile at the entrance. The cavern was already well lit by the glowworms, huge, sluggish animals dotted here and there that shone with a steady yet dim fluorescence, like a low-watt light bulb. And the flame huffers gave off extra little bursts of light that flickered on and off as they breathed in and out. Predictably, most of the boys headed towards the plug uglies of the dragon world. Snotlout made a big fuss about grabbing a vicious-looking monstrous nightmare, smiling nastily at Hiccup as he did so. Snotlout was the son of Baggy Bum, the beer belly, Stoic, the vast younger brother. He was intending to get rid of Hiccup sometime in the future so that he, Snotlout, would become chief of the hairy hooligan tribe. And a gruesome and terrifying chief, as Snotlout meant to be, would need a properly awesome dragon. Warthog and Dog's Breath got into a loudly whispered fight over a Gronkle, a heavily armoured brute with fangs like kitchen knives sticking out in such numbers that it couldn't keep its mouth shut. Dog's Breath won, then managed to drop it as he was trying to bundle it into his basket. The weaponry of the beast made a horribly loud clatter as it landed on the floor of the cavern. The Gronkle opened its evil crocodile eyes. Everybody held their breath. The Gronkle stared ahead. It was difficult to tell from its blank expression whether it was awake or fast asleep. Hiccup realised in an agony of suspense that the gossamer thin third eyelid was still down. And there it stayed for a few heart-stopping moments until it slowly closed its upper eyelids again. Amazingly, not one of the other dragons woke up. A few grumbled groggily before making themselves comfy again. But most were in such a stupor that they barely even stirred. Hiccup let out his breath slowly. Maybe these dragons were so dead to the world that nothing would wake them. He swallowed hard, muttered a prayer to Loki, the patron saint of sneaky exploits, and edged forward cautiously to grab the most unconscious-looking dragon so he could get out of his nightmare as fast as possible. It is a little known fact that the dragons grow colder the deeper they sleep. It is even possible for a dragon to go into a sleep coma, in which they are icy cold with no obvious pulse or breath or heartbeat. They can stay in this state for centuries, and only a highly skilled expert can tell from looking at them if they're alive or dead. But a dragon who is awake or lightly sleeping is very warm indeed, like bread that has just come out of the oven. Hiccup found one that was about the right size and fairly cool to the touch, and manoeuvred it into his basket as quickly and carefully as he could. It was a very basic brown, but at that moment Hiccup could not have cared less. Even though it was barely half grown, it was surprisingly heavy. "I did it, I did it, I did it!" he chanted happily to himself. At least he wasn't going to be the only boy in the class who didn't have a dragon. Everybody seemed to have got themselves one by now, and they were all making their way quietly towards the exit. Everybody, that was, except for Fishlegs, who was already covered in a bright red, itchy rash and was at that very moment approaching a pile of knottily entangled nadders on very loud tiptoes. Fishlegs was even worse at burglary than Dog's Breath. Hiccup stopped dead in his tracks. "Don't do it, Fishlegs! Please don't do it!" he whispered. But Fishlegs was fed up of Snotlout's taunting and of being sneered and jeered at. He was going to get himself a really cool dragon that all the other boys would respect. Squinting so hard he could barely see the pile of dragons, his eyes streaming and scratching himself violently, Fishlegs reached slowly towards the bottom-most dragon, took one leg in his hand and gently yanked. The entire pile came crashing down in a furious tangle of limbs and wings and ears. Every boy in the cavern gave a horrified gasp. Most of the nadders snapped crossly at each other before settling back down to sleep. One brute, bigger than the others, opened his eyes and blinked a few times. Hiccup noted with great relief that the third eyelid was still down. The boys waited for the eyes to close. And then Fishlegs sneezed. Choo! 4 gigantic sneezes that went echoing and bouncing off the cavern walls. The big nadder stared sightlessly ahead, frozen like a dragon statue, but very faintly an ominous purring noise began in his throat, and very slowly the third eyelid slid upward. "Uh-oh," whispered Hiccup. The nadder's head suddenly whipped round to face Fishlegs, its yellow cat eyes snapping into focus on the boy. It unfolded its wings to their greatest extent and stealthily advanced like a panther about to spring. It opened its mouth wide enough to show the forked dragon tongue and "Run!" shouted Hiccup, grabbing Fishlegs' arm and dragging him away. The boys ran for the exit tunnel. Fishlegs and Hiccup were the last to get there. There was no time to pick up the torches, so they were running in the pitch black. The basket with the basic brown dragon in it was bumping on Hiccup's back. They had 2 minutes start on the dragon because it took a while for the first dragon to wake everybody else up, but Hiccup could hear a furious roaring and flapping as the dragon started to pour into the tunnel after the boys. He ran a little faster. The dragons could move more quickly than the boys because they could see better in the dark, but they were held up when the tunnel got smaller because they had to fold their wings up to squirm through. "I haven't got a dragon," panted Fishlegs, a couple of paces behind Hiccup. "That," said Hiccup as he scrambled frantically on his elbows through a narrow bit, "is the repeated Fishlegs stubbornly. "Oh, for Thor's sake," snapped Hiccup. He thrust his basket into Fishleg's arms and grabbed the empty one from Fishleg's back. "Have mine then, wait here." And Hiccup turned and went back through the narrow bit, even though the roaring was getting louder and closer by the second. "What are you doing?" screamed Fishlegs, frantically dancing up and down on the spot. Hiccup came back through the hole again, precious moments later. Fishlegs grabbed hold of an arm to help him haul him through. They could hear a horrible snuffling as what sounded like the nose of a dragon entered the other end of the hole. Hiccup bunged a rock at it and it squealed indignantly. They turned a corner and suddenly they could see light from outside at the end of the final tunnel. Fishlegs went first, but just as Hiccup was kneeling down to follow, a dragon pounced on him with a flap and a shriek. Hiccup hit it and it fell back enough for him to crawl towards the light. Another dragon, or maybe the same one, sank its fangs into Hiccup's calf. He was so desperate to get out, he dragged the animal through with him. As soon as Hiccup's head and shoulders were through into the light, there was Gobber. He grabbed Hiccup under the armpits and hauled him out, dragons pouring after him. "Jump!" yelled Gobber as he stunned a dragon with one blow of his mighty fist. "What do you mean, jump?" Hiccup hesitated as he looked down at the dizzying drop into the sea. "No time to climb down," panted Gobber, banging a couple of dragons' heads together and bouncing 3 more off his gigantic belly. "Jump!" Hiccup closed his eyes and leapt off the cliff. As he plunged through the air, the dragon that was attached to his leg released its jaw with a squawk of alarm and flew off. Hiccup was travelling at such speed by the time he hit the water that he didn't feel like water at all, more like something hard and painful and so cold that he nearly passed out. He spluttered to the surface, amazed to find that he didn't appear to be dead, and was immediately drenched by the gigantic splash of Gobber the Belch, landing a couple of feet away from him. Shrieking furiously, the dragons swarmed out of the cave and dive-bombed the floating Vikings. Hiccup pulled his helmet as far down as it would go. There was a horrible scraping sound as dragons' talons raked across the metal. Another one landed, hissing on the water right in front of Hiccup's face. It took off again with a screech when it felt how cold the sea was. The dragons didn't like flying through the snow, and with relief, Hiccup watched as they flew back to scream terrible dragons' insults in Dragonese from the warmth of the cave entrance. Gobber started to pull the boys out of the sea and onto the rocks. Viking boys are strong swimmers, but it is difficult to keep afloat when you have a basket full of trapped, terrified dragon on your back. Hiccup was the last to be saved, just in time as the cold was beginning to put him to sleep. "Well, at least that wasn't death," thought Hiccup, as Gobber grabbed him by the neck to rescue him, nearly drowning him again in the process. But it certainly wasn't glory either.